Well, hello and welcome everyone to today's LRS Security Solutions webinar. My name is Ryan Howarder and I'm on the marketing team here at LRS. Presenting today will be Josh Brandt, Cybersecurity Strategist and Virtual CISO at LRS, and Chris Hill, Security Practice Leader at LRS. And kicking off today will be Fran Malloy, Principal Security Technical Sales Manager. We will have a live Q&A session at the end. To participate, you can use a Q&A function in Zoom. You can find that by hovering over the Zoom toolbar and clicking that Q&A button. You can type in your question there and we will get to as many as we can at the end. We also can follow up afterwards and we will get started. So Fran, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. Give me a minute and I will share my screen. How's it look, Ryan?
Looks good, Fran.
Hi. So thank you all for joining the webinar and thank LRS for putting this together. I'm going to start the webinar out with a little story about a credit card breach. And hopefully you'll get a couple nuggets out of this as far as what's important, what you should know, and things like that. And then after that, we'll have LRS talk about some of their offerings and things like that. So I joined IBM 5 years ago. And before that, I was director of infrastructure and security and different things within this company. And I'm just going to go through this story about a credit card breach and take you through it. So this is a North American retailer. They sell outdoor apparel. And they're based in the US and Canada. They have about 325 stores in the US, 30 of them were in Canada. And it's $1 billion company, privately held by a firm in San Francisco. And I'm going through this chart right now to give you an idea of how IT was organized as far as supporting this company. So we had a distribution center and a call center in Columbus, Ohio. And we had a sourcing office in Hong Kong. And that sourcing office was because we manufactured most of our apparel in Asia and some in Central America. We used that sourcing office so they could better manage the vendors that manufactured it. So that sourcing office was just 30 desktops with a firewall and a file server. But IT had to support that. And then the data center is in the Chicago area where I'm at, and we had 150 people in IT. We also had affiliates in Europe and Asia, so we had stores in Germany and Japan. But those stores, it was mostly franchisees, so we sold them the clothing, the apparel, we tagged it, and then they sold it under our brand, but from an IT standpoint, we didn't have anything to do with that. But from an IT standpoint, we were responsible for all the stores, the distribution center, the sourcing office, and the data center itself. And this is the organization at the time of the breach. I was the director of support operations and risk management. So I reported directly to the CIO, and we had 3 other directors. One director had the website. One director had infrastructure for network storage, DBAs, et cetera. And the other director had every other application, that's support and application development. I was responsible for desktop. I was responsible for the service desk. I was responsible for problem management, change management, the distribution center, and the call center from an IT standpoint, but I also had security. And in security, I had 3 people reporting to me. One was a person that did identity and access management, meaning they added and deleted all the user IDs. You know, if we had part-time employees at the store, they added those, deleted those. All Windows, a lot of Windows-based Active Directory management and things like that. So I had one person handling that. I had one person that handled all the security tools, and then I had a manager. So I only had 3 people within security at the time of this breach. And then this is how I saw the risk throughout the company. And, during this process, you're trying to figure out, okay, I've got all this risk. What's the most important thing I should work on? And so we had cardholder information, which is credit card information, in the Rackspace hosted website. We had it in the stores. We also had it in the mainframe, and we had it in the call center. But we had customer information outsourced in our loyalty marketing system, which was outsourced to Epsilon at the time. So if you bought something and you gave us your email address, we had that information and all your order history out at Epsilon. So that was a concern. Also, payroll and HR were housed at Ceridian. And that meant we had a Ceridian server, but every paid day, we would send up a file to Ceridian, and they would send out the direct deposits or cut any checks and things like that. And it's interesting because Ceridian had their own breach 6 months before ours, where they had lost 200 of our employees' W-2s. And it wasn't just our company, it was several companies, but that was an issue itself. And then in general, we had lots of Oracle retail systems. We had Office 365 that was hosted by Microsoft. So we had all that risk. And as I said before, part of it was determining what should I work on first? What's our most risky thing? And then getting the support behind that. So that just gives you a general idea of the company. So you have an idea, 150 people, 325 stores, 8,000 part-time employees at the stores. And then right now I'll go through the breach itself. So the next 7 or 8 slides are just going through this slide one at a time, so you know where I am in the timeline. So, and I'm going to go through the discovery all the way to the class action lawsuit. So, and this is 2016. So on July 4th weekend in 2016, I received a call from my CIO. And the CIO said, "Hey, Fran, we've got a problem." And usually at this time, because I had the distribution center, the call center, I had the service desk, which meant all calls came through me, and store support, I was thinking, we couldn't print at the distribution center. Therefore, we couldn't put a label on and we couldn't ship. Or we had a store that was down with connectivity or some other issue. And she said, "No, I think we have a security issue." And what she said was, we received a call from Brian Krebs. And Brian Krebs is a forensics journalist, for those that don't know. He publishes a website, and he has acquaintances in the security business and in the financial industry. And, he has access to the dark web and all sorts of things. So at that time, remember in 2016, as a retailer, we knew he had announced the Wendy's breach 3 different times because there were more and more credit cards that were out. And we knew that he announced the Target breach, which was a big, big deal from the retail industry back then. So when you get a call from Brian Krebs, it's not the best day you've had. And what he said was, "We're seeing your company as a point of fraud." And what he said was, I have a credit union, people in a credit union in the state of Texas, and people in a credit union in the state of Washington are saying that your company is a point of fraud. And we asked him if he had any more information. He said no. And the first thing you do is we decided to tell him, "Hey, listen, we're not investigating anything right now. But if we do find something else, we'll keep you updated." And we made a deal with him that we would let him announce right before we did. And he agreed to that. And it might have been because we weren't, we were 20 times smaller than Target, or that we were working with him, but he did agree to that. And so, so what does it mean that a credit union is seeing fraud? Well, a credit union for the most part, doesn't have automated systems back then. So they're probably looking at 15 fraudulent statements of their credit card. They have credit cards. So they're looking at where did everybody buy and what did they have in common? Well, they all bought from my company. So that's all we had to go on. So the first thing we did is the CIO said, "Hey, Fran, what's our incident response plan?" And we had an incident response plan when Amy or Chris get a virus on their desktop, and we open a ticket, and we wipe their desktop and things like that. We had incident response plans for all sorts of things, but we didn't have one for a significant breach. What our plan was to get me together with the CIO, the chief legal counsel, and the director of infrastructure and the CFO, and decide what to do next. And that's the first thing I tell people, customers, is make sure you have an incident response plan. The second thing we did is we made a decision with chief legal counsel that we would not tell anyone that Brian Krebs called, that we would keep that under attorney-client privilege. And the reason for that is, if you notice from this timeline, July 4th is when I got the first call. We didn't announce till August 18th. And IT people are usually pretty friendly. So, if we told them that was going on and the press called them, they would say, "Oh yeah, we're investigating a breach," things like that. So we wanted to make sure we had that narrative and that we could control that narrative. So we only let 7 to 10 people know that Brian Krebs called, those that knew already, and we didn't tell anybody else. And I'm going to pause right there to see, did we get any questions in the chat or anything like that? Because I can't see it. If we did, just go ahead and interrupt me.
Yeah, nothing right now, Fran.
Okay, but feel free to ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A. So the next thing that happened is we brought in a forensics investigator. And what I suggest is that you have a contract with a forensics investigator already in place. So I was responsible for contracts, and I knew that my legal team wanted to read every contract before they allowed us to sign it. So, it took sometimes 6 weeks to get a contract through. And when you have an issue and you have a small team that can't investigate, you need to get an incident response plan. You need to have a retainer in place. And I know LRS does this with some of their top talent, like they've got like Chris, and IBM does this. But pick a firm, make sure you have a retainer in place so that they're there the next day and they can answer a call within 4 hours. So we actually had one in place because of the Ceridian breach earlier. We were investigating that to make sure we didn't have any issues. So immediately, this forensics investigator comes on site, and we're in the Chicago data center, and they start looking for anything. So they're looking at logs from the SIM, logs from antivirus. They're asking for backups of systems and images of servers, all sorts of things. So they're searching, not finding anything. And by the way, the IT team doesn't know what's going on, but we're stopping them from doing their main projects and saying, you have to do this right away. We're investigating something, but we didn't tell them anything else. And after a week and a half, what happened is we had Trend Micro antivirus on our store registers, which are just PCs, and we had it on all of our office equipment, all the corporate equipment, corporate desktops and servers. And there was a different version of that Trend Micro antivirus on one store in St. Louis, and it was showing that something was being added at around midnight, something was being deleted right away. It wasn't quarantining it as it normally should, but it was coming out with a message that said possible ransomware. So remember, the forensics investigator, he's in there charging us $500 an hour. We ask him, hey, listen, do you want to see this? He says yes. So he sends two people right out of college at $350 an hour to go to St. Louis, take the hard drives out of the registers, the PCs, document it for chain of custody, and send it to their lab in Seattle. And what they found out was it wasn't ransomware, it was RAM scraping software. Very similar to what happened at other retailers. So what was happening was, as somebody was buying at my store, this was back in 2016. So we were in the middle of moving from swiping your credit card to chip and signature. So if you swipe the credit card, you would actually hand it to the associate. She would swipe it for you, give you back your credit card. We would read in the credit card information. We would encrypt it with our own encryption key. We'd send it to the bank, which was Bank of America Merchant Services. They would decrypt it. They would look at it and say, yes, he's got enough money to buy this down code. And they would send an authorization code and send him on the way. What was happening, though, is at the same time that we were reading the credit card information in, this RAM scraping software, this in-memory software, was reading the credit card information at the same time, encrypting it with their own encryption key, and then saving it to an obscure Windows folder on the store server. And then every Thursday, it was sending it out to a test development server in the Chicago data center that was sending it out to a IP address in New York City that forwarded on to an IP address in Russia. So that's what we found out after a week and a half. And as you notice from this timeline, we didn't announce for 4.5 more weeks. So what are we doing during this time? Well, we're trying to figure out how they got in, how many places they're in, and then the scope of it and how long they've been in. And during this time, the CEO is pressuring us to announce as soon as possible. And the reason for that is 75% of our sales happen during the Christmas holiday as a retail apparel. As an apparel retailer, 75% of our sales were during that time. So he wanted to announce as soon as possible so that the customers would have as much time in between that and they would forget. So by the way, all during this time, my life changed a little bit. I was working 7 days a week, 14 hours a day. I was on conference calls with the outside legal, with the CIO, and with chief legal counsel, and with a forensics investigator and the director of infrastructure. The 5 of us were on a call 3 times a day, 7 days a week, and working 14-hour days. So it was very, very stressful during this time. So back to, a week and a half later, we found this, that it was RAM scraping software. In the next 4.5 weeks, what we found out is they appeared to get in around Christmas time of 2015. And it took them, and it was a phishing attack that a merchant answered. They got access, they got her credentials, they got access to her laptop. They scanned the environment and found that test development server in the Chicago data center. They saw that a domain admin account, which is a super user account, was being used on that. And there was a patch that wasn't installed that addressed a vulnerability that Microsoft came out with that was called Pass the Hash. And Microsoft came out with this 3 months earlier, and the patch was not installed on that test development server. So that Pass the Hash meant that they could get a password. So they had a domain admin account and a password, and that's a super user account, and you can create other ones. So, and And we found out they started around Christmas time, but it took them about 3 weeks to get the variant right, to find our where the credit cards were, where the stores were. So around January 15th, until we turned them off right before the announcement, they were in the system. They were not in the website. They were not in the mainframe. They're not anywhere else except in the POS system. But from January 15th until August 16th or so, in 298 of the 325 stores. So after you found that out, we had to do a couple things. And one of them was you have to call the FBI. So make sure that you have a contact within your local FBI office in the cybersecurity division. But we called, because we were based in Seattle, we called one out of Seattle. And we told them what was going on. And what was interesting is we told them what was going on, and we contacted Trend Micro, and we told them about this, and they said, oh, this is 0 day. We don't have it. So they put it in their signature file. When we talked to him, he said, I'm dealing with 3 other merchants right now that are going through the same thing you're going through. And so we asked, could we talk to them to share ideas and stuff like that? And he said, well, they're under investigation right now, so no. And we ended up giving him IP addresses that we were going to block, and he gave us some to block, but he told us to keep them informed as to what's going on. But that was really it for the FBI. And we kept them informed later on. But the other thing you do during the containment for a credit card breach is you have to call whoever approves your payment card industry audit. And that was Bank of America Merchant Services, and they help set up the calls with Visa, MasterCard, American Express, et cetera. They still, when you meet with them, they still beat you up separately, but they set up the calls. They also told us that we need to bring in a second forensics investigator, and I'll talk about that a little later. Now, I'm going to pause right there. At this time, remember, they had access to a domain admin account, a super user account. Back then, they were going after credit cards. Now, with that access, they would have gone after ransomware. They would have started encrypting everything, possibly. Or they would have tried to take over some systems, depending on which industry you're in. But it's very similar no matter what kind of issue that you do have. So we started the containment just a couple days before the announcement. And that's because they had a super user account. We didn't want to play whack-a-mole with them. And we wanted to make sure where they were. So we shut them down just a couple days before the announcement. And that things in the containment that we did was we blocked IP addresses. We deleted domain admin accounts that we could. Those that we couldn't, we changed the password. And then we cleaned all the registers and the servers of this. Those are the type of things we did during the containment. After the containment, we announced, and during the announcement, there were a couple interesting things. Number one is we sent a note out. We sent a letter out, a physical letter in the mail to every customer that bought anything between those dates. Now, remember, the credit card information that they had was encrypted with their encryption key, so we could not see what went out. So we didn't know for sure what was exfiltrated, but we sent a letter to every customer that bought in those 298 stores. And in that letter was created by the outside PR firm, by the way. So you're probably going to need an outside PR firm at the time. In that letter, we had free credit reporting, which the outside PR firm put together. We also had an 800 number to call, which the outside PR firm put that call center together. So when people call in, they had somebody to answer. That PR firm also put together the press release. So all of that for that PR firm was probably $1 million right there. And the other thing is As I told you before, Brian Krebs announced 45 minutes before we did. But the thing in the announcement is when you have stores, if you're going to send letters out to customers, some amount of customers are going to come to the store and ask your store employees what's going on. So you've got 8,000 part-time employees that you have to train right away on that day with some pretty simple messaging, but you have to let them know what's going on before somebody comes to that store. So you've got that logistical issue too. The other thing that happens is a couple things is your friends find out. People within IT find out. I've been processing this for 6 weeks. They kind of didn't figure it out completely. So they're going through that too. And vendors see it also. And some, and you get a lot of emails from vendors, a lot of voicemails from vendors, things like that. So that's what happens during the announcement. So immediately after the announcement, we started remediation, and my budget increased by 4 times. What I had before and what I had after the breach was a factor of 4. And for remediation, we did a couple things. Number one, we brought in a privileged access management system like IBM's product called Verify Privilege. We had a SIM, but remember, I had one person that was part-time looking at it. So we outsourced that. So we had eyes on glass 24/7. LRS does that. IBM does that. We also started a network segmentation project, which is not a simple thing to do. It doesn't take a day to do a network segmentation project. It takes months. So we started that. And we also brought in a patching system. We were using Microsoft's patching system at the time. And at that time, it was inadequate for what we did. So we brought in a separate patching system. But you're starting remediation and all of that. Now, I had talked about that when you call the Bank of America Merchant Services, and under contract, when you have a breach, you have to bring in a second forensics investigator. Now, the first forensics investigator, he didn't write anything down. Everything was verbal because you're going to have a class action lawsuit. So this second forensics investigator, when he comes in, he's actually going to put together a report that says, this is how the breach happened. Here's all the credit cards that could possibly have been compromised. And then they do another payment card industry audit on you, another PCI audit on you. And that report is discoverable in a class action lawsuit. And you can manage that report. You're paying for that report that they send back to the banks. And the banks use it so they know which credit cards to pull back that might be fraudulent, but they also use it to fine you. But it is discoverable since you're sending it to a bank, so you can manage that report with them. By the way, the first forensics investigator was probably $500,000. The second one was another $500,000. So the forensic investigator left around October of 2016. In November of 2016, we received a class action lawsuit. And what happens is someone puts up a website that says, hey, have you been affected by this company's breach? And if you have, they find a plaintiff. And they found another credit union, not the one in Texas or Washington, but another one. And so we were served that lawsuit. So what happens in a lawsuit is you either settle right away, and if you don't settle, you go into discovery. And when you go into discovery, you start asking for information and you start subpoenaing, you start asking people for depositions. So you subpoena people. And they subpoena people that know what's going on, like me. So when they subpoena you, it's just like it is on TV. They knock at your door. They say, hey, are you Francis Malloy? I say, yes, you need to appear in this lawyer's office on this date. And if you can't make it, you can get another date. But what's happened in that deposition, it's interesting because there's a couple things that I learned from it. One is you're sitting at this big long table, and it's a big long white table in a conference room, just like an IBM or an LRS conference room. And I'm sitting there at the end of the table, and to my left is my lawyer who's representing me, looking down at his paper the entire time. And then to my right is the stenographer who's taking down everything that's asked and answered. And then to her right is the opposing lawyer. And then to his right is the opposing lawyer's trainee. But across from me is the cameraman. And for this type of deposition, they can keep you for 7.5 hours of testimony, not including lunch and breaks. And they do keep you for that time. And it is a bit stressful. But there's a couple things in that you should know about. One is, back then they had access to all my email and all my instant messaging, which was Microsoft Skype at the time. And when they have access to that, let me go back a little bit. Back during this remediation, I was looking at some software with my desktop manager. Now, my desktop manager also had the distribution center and the call center. So he's based in Columbus, Ohio. So we're looking at some software that would isolate software, sort of like Mass 360 does for mobile devices. So he sends me an instant message that says, "Hey, Fran, would this have prevented the breach?" So when they're looking at my email, they're not just looking at everything. They're using search arguments like the word breach. So because he said that, those 16 pages of my instant message with him were put in front of me during the deposition, and I was asked to read it and then answer questions about it. So get with your legal team, understand what you should and shouldn't say, what you should and shouldn't write down, what you shouldn't text, what you shouldn't instant message, those type of things. The other thing that happened during the class action lawsuit is we did internal pen tests, and we had to do internal pen tests for payment card industry audits, for PCI audits, but you should do internal pen tests. And LRS does that, IBM does that. You should get a reputable firm like one of those two to do your internal pen test. And what an internal pen test is, for those that don't know, is we had somebody come in and we said, "Hey, I'm going to give you an ID, a non-privileged ID. I want you to try to find credit card information." So they do, but they create a report that says, "This is how I got in, and here's 40 different recommendations on what you should do to secure your environment." Well, that report is discoverable. So there's a couple things. Number one, do these, but don't put them on the shelf. Make sure you have a project to get them done, but put them under attorney-client privilege so they're not put in front of you during this deposition. Because they put it in front of me and they said, "Hey, Fran, I see we got 40 different recommendations. Let's go through them one at a time." And I'm not working for this company anymore a year and a half later. "Let's go through them one at a time and tell me which ones you did and which ones you didn't." So make sure you do them, but put them under attorney-client privilege. And Chris, I'm almost done here. So the last thing I want to tell about the story is, when you have a credit card breach, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Bank of America Merchant Services, they take that report from the forensics investigator and they fine you. And our fines were significant at that time. We didn't realize how big they would be. And I was not working for this company at the time, but the chief legal counsel was managing the number, saying, and that by that I mean he was telling the CFO, "I think it's going to be this number." Well, it came in and he apparently missed a digit. So they're significant. So the question you may ask is, how much did this cost? Well, and here are some insights, and most of these I've talked about before. I left the company in January of 2017. So I left right at the end of this timeline. At that time, the cost was $3.5 million for those two forensics investigators, and for the PR firm and things like that. It did not include the class action lawsuit. It did not include the legal fees for that. It didn't include the fines. They settled the lawsuit for $9.9 million a year and a half later. So at a minimum, this cost around $13.4 million at a minimum, and I don't have all the costs in there. So let me just make sure I've gone through this. I've talked about attorney-client privilege. Get with your legal team so they can teach you what you should do and make decisions about that beforehand. I'm not a lawyer, but there are some things we could have done better. You're going to need outside counsel. You're going to need an outside PR firm no matter what happens. I talked about that forensics report that the second forensics investigator came through, that you can manage it. We also had dedicated support post-breach. So that first forensics investigator is still in there at $15,000 a month. And then privileged accounts. I talked about IBM's product, which is called Verified Privilege. That might have prevented the breach if we had done that, if we had something in there that managed those accounts, meaning you checked them in and out, it recorded everything that was going on, it automatically changed passwords at any interval you want, those type of things. And then internal pen tests, I talked, yes, let's do them. So a few lessons learned with the products that IBM has that LRS can present to you. One is a retainer. We call it an iris retainer or a retainer with LRS. We have a product called SOAR, which was resilient at the time. That product can help you manage issues. So for instance, we had Canadian customers. So we were looking at our outside legal team to tell us when we had to announce for somebody in the province of Ontario or in Calgary or something like that. And he was coming back to us and saying, I have to use an outside firm myself, and it's going to take another week. Well, you could blow away your reporting requirements at that time. The SOAR product has reporting requirements for a credit card breach, for a HIPAA breach, for privacy, for anything. We have 6 lawyers behind that, and it can tell you right away. And it would probably saved us quite a bit of money. I had talked about before about just understanding where all your data is. Guardium and discovery and classification can help do that and can help monitor your databases. I talked about verified privilege. Endpoint detection and response. This was a 0-day attack. And IBM has reached an agreement with a company that we just bought a couple of months ago called Reacta, where it uses behavior analytics, and you can get access to these 0-day issues before they are 0-day issues because it works on analytics. And then a SIM, QRadar XDR, which we have. But those are some of the products. Now, one last thing before we take any questions and go to Chris. I've gone through one issue. We have a cyber range in Boston that we do remotely also, where we can take your teams through these type of incidents. Now, this one has all the bells and whistles, and it has things that you're going to go through, like 3 or 4 things at one time, very, very quickly. But you can practice your incident response plan there, and that's an issue. And so if you want to go through that, talk to your IBM team, talk to your LRS team. And I'm going to pass it on to the next person. So thank you very much for listening and for going through all this with me. I do appreciate it. If you have any questions, just put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A.
Fran, thank you very much. I understand. I've lived a little bit of the life you lived and understand how awful it can be on a day-to-day experience to get through a breach. So it really is good to hear. You're on the other side of this, obviously, but it is a daunting task to take on efforts like this. So Josh and I are going to spend a little bit of time talking to you guys today about some of the things and offerings we have to help get the basics right. So Fran talked a little bit about privileged access management. A lot of it goes down to just, getting basics and stuff right. So give me a second here. I'm going to get set up and share my screen. so you guys can see what we got going on.
And if you guys ever get a chance to talk to Chris, he's been through some of these same things. He's got a very interesting background too, if you ever got to talk to him in person.
Thank you, Fran. So go ahead, Josh, I'm gonna let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
All right. Thanks, Chris. And thank you again, Fran, for that message on your experiences. So my name is Joshua Brandt with LRS. I've been with the company for about 4 years now. Quite similar to Fran, though, however, I came from the customer side. I was the chief security officer for a global manufacturing company, was there for about 6 years in that role prior to coming on board with LRS. So here I serve in a capacity as a strategic consultant for our clients and also as a virtual CISO. And Chris.
All right. And good afternoon, everybody. Similar to Josh and Fran, myself, I come from the customer side. So 24 years in state government, former CISO of the state of Illinois. But, it goes back to the fact that we have put together a team here at LRS that can most certainly talk and help you guys in these situations as Fran described. And as Fran mentioned, I've lived them as well, and it's not a fun day. A little bit about LRS. I don't know if everybody on the phone is familiar with LRS, on the video call here is familiar with LRS, but we are a worldwide organization. The interesting thing is our headquarters is right here in Springfield, Illinois. Josh and I both work in the headquarters, but we do have offices across the globe. A family-owned business, and I personally love and have always enjoyed working for the LRS organization. A little fun fact, if you're a drag car NHRA fan, we are the primary sponsor for Tim Wilkerson's racing team. It's a nitro funny car. And just a little thing, if you have some initiatives, want to get out and watch that, we'd be happy to, to give you guys a little bit more education on what we do in that space. But it's a fun little side note that I'd like to talk about that LRS sponsors. A little bit about our mission. I'm not going to read this, obviously, but really what I think, what I wanted to tell you folks on the call is that, as Josh mentioned, we both come from the client side, customer side, and we've only been doing this a short time. It's hard for us to take off that client-facing hat. We take the consultative approach, so we want to extend, the tooling and stuff that you've already invested in, and that really comes into our vCISO offerings that we have. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about that, reach out to your LRS representative, and we can get you guys lined up and have some conversations around that offering. All right, Josh.
All right. Well, I just want to take a few minutes here to talk about the security services that we provide for those of you who may not be familiar with LRS. So we are a full stack solution provider. We focus really in 3 pillars here. You'll see in the circular diagram on the right. We've built out centers of excellence around professional services, managed services, and response services, where professional services, we focus on things like engineering, architecture, development, consulting. Those are generally where we start engagements or start relationships with new clients. That's how we build that trust, build rapport, and certainly want to deliver results to you that show we're committed to being that consultative and trusted advisor, like Chris had mentioned. From there, we typically then kind of transition into more your managed services, right? So managed SIM, managed SOC, those type of functionalities where, it may be eyes on glass for, 8x5 or 24/7, whatever the case may be for your particular environment. And then from there, in the event of something happening, we move into a response type situation where, maybe it is IR, or maybe it's threat hunting or some sort of a forensic response. So those are also capabilities that we provide, which then kind of would move back into professional services, from a corrections mitigation perspective. So that's kind of the continuum or life cycle of the solutions that we provide. We also have education services, which does not fall under our particular group but it is part of our security services overall. So we certainly want to highlight that, we have education. That's for most security vendors out there who have training and certification. And then some are framework aligned, such as NIST. And we can do not only training, but also assessments and various other services that are around NIST. Today, we want to talk just about a few things, very high level. This will not be a technical conversation at all, but really we just wanted to touch on a few areas that we thought, really aligned with the message that Fran was bringing forward, and are areas that, we're having a lot of conversations with our clients. We feel like these are critically important and probably going to be more important as time goes by and we see the threat landscape continuing to grow. One of the first areas we're going to touch on is security assessments, some of the various types of approaches that are used to measure vulnerabilities, risks, and threats. Also, cyber insurance, we're going to cover. That's definitely a hot topic right now. I'm sure that many of you are dealing with that or are considering cyber insurance if you've not already done so. There's been a lot of change in 2022, and we're sure that that's going to continue to be something of significant interest moving forward. And then obviously we'll have that Q&A time at the end. So here, I'm not going to read this slide, but really just want to talk about assessments at a high level. We feel that security assessments are critically important for all organizations. It really is necessary to understand the maturity, the strength of your defenses, to know where you're at and to know where your gaps are. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the various security frameworks like NIST or CIS, or that they all focus on assets right at the start. Know what hardware you have, know what software you have. You have to know what should or shouldn't be in your environment before you can effectively secure it. Assessments kind of build upon that. You have to know where you're at, where you may be missing key things that, it takes a certain specialization or a certain perspective maybe to be identified. So that's where the assessments really come to play. There are many types of security assessments out there. We've got a few listed here, and each of these has its own purpose. You're going to see a different or unique value come out of each of these types. So vulnerability assessments, that's looking for flaws in software or bugs, configuration issues, things like that pose risks to your environment, things that could be exploited by a bad actor. Penetration testing, Fran mentioned that several times. Very important, probably one of the most, most often required from a compliance perspective or things of that nature, regulatory, very, very commonly executed type of assessment in a security environment. Red team takes that just a little further, and it's kind of a penetration test, but focus more on testing your defenses, your blue team if you have one, or maybe you have a managed security provider. It's ensuring that you're getting the value out of those specific tools. Framework assessments really are more of a, do you check the boxes? Have you implemented the controls that align with a specific security framework like NIST or CIS or many others? Do you have this control in place? Is it effective? Do you have documentation? Those types of things. It's kind of a checkbox type of assessment, but it's very detailed, a lot of breadth. And then finally, risk assessments. So the way I look at risk assessments they tell you where you should be focusing your security spend. Because if this is something that's, a very costly area, costly to the business, and there's a high likelihood that something bad could happen there, that's where we need to focus our security dollars. Chris often likes to say, we don't want to put a $100 lock on a $5 bicycle. So, that's what the risk assessment helps you identify. But we do want to talk about a different assessment here briefly, and we call this a cyber risk analysis. And this is a LRS proprietary assessment, and it's one that we created because we feel like it's a little easier to step into. A lot of customers, we see organizations in all phases of their security journey and their assessment journey, if you will. Some that are doing pen tests very regularly, some have never done a pen test, some are doing these other types of assessments. But I would say for organizations that maybe are on the lower end of the maturity scale, the pen test is often a bit overwhelming. And I liken it to, I've heard people say that the heaviest weight at the gym is the front door, right? So it's kind of like that with getting started with testing. And we found that through conversation with customers that, I know I've got all these issues, so I don't need you to tell me what I already know, but I also don't know how to get started on correcting things. So we developed the cyber risk analysis to be much more narrow, but deeper, and focus on very specific areas that we see commonly exploited by bad actors, or the areas that we would be exploiting if we were performing a pen test for you. So it focuses on Active Directory, firewall security, and internal and external vulnerabilities. And those are the three areas, because we know that those are targets. And like I said, it's targets not only for bad actors, but for us. And really, like I said, we developed this to be initially as kind of a precursor to a pen test, but over time, this engagement has grown. The reporting has grown. It's very comprehensive. And now we're seeing organizations that are doing this in addition to penetration testing, and not only in addition to, but multiple times in a year, because the results are very quantitative. So we don't want to focus the discussion today entirely on the CRA, but we do feel like it's very important. We feel like it could put you in a much better position to be prepared and improve your defensive posture, and hopefully avoid that malicious event or worse, a breach situation.
All right, Josh, thank you very much. We're going to move over into our cyber insurance conversation. And the reason that we're bringing this to light today is a couple things. As Josh mentioned, we're seeing more and more activity around the cyber insurance space because of the things that Fran pointed out and the cost of the organization that he worked for, that came along with the fact that a user got in and got administrative credentials. So what we're seeing is, common policy coverage, right? I'm not going to read through these, but much like car insurance, I think inevitably you're going to see some of these requirements, especially for certain, verticals out there in the business world that are just going to be required to have cyber insurance. So today we're going to go through 7 steps of what we consider or what we typically see that cyber insurance organizations are requiring that businesses have in place in order to get cyber insurance, because like many things, they're not going to just flat out give you cyber insurance anymore, because the bad actors are continuing to win in these fights. So the requirements that we see, and this comes into some of the things that are coming out of both the federal government and probably inevitably into the state government space, but most certainly from insurance regulators. So we're going to go through each one of these 7 steps. We're going to spend a lot of time on here because I know we're running short on some of our time, but I did want to hit these 7 things real quick. So, all right, Josh.
Yeah, so very quickly on multi-factor authentication, I think most everyone is probably familiar now with what MFA is, probably using it in your personal lives, if not in your professional business, day to day. Just a couple things here. When you think about MFA, really it's just another way to verify that you are who you say you are. And it's by showing something that you have, like a token, something that like your PIN or a password, and then something that you are, which would be like a fingerprint or some sort of biometric data. Typically 2 of those, any 2, but they have to be in different categories, are considered multi-factor authentication. Probably the one thing to call out here is at the bottom, just to note that this list has been around for years, but it has been expanded really since COVID. I think it was the major driver, but now location is also part of that checking mechanism. So, kind of that conditional access is somewhere you are. Are you supposed to be here? Are you supposed to be trying to log in from this location?
All right, we talked a little bit. Fran actually mentioned this, and in the kill chain of things that happen in the cycle of events in his organization. But phishing still is a major concern for all organizations. We talked a little bit about education services and the things that we have going on there. But most certainly, security awareness training is going to be key for organizations to continue to be successful against these attacks. Your users are most certainly your first line of defense. And another term I'm kind of a term guy, but I've heard this in the past, but the worst day in your organization can start with the user's click. And that's exactly what Fran lived, as well as myself and some of my prior lives. So the power that the user has is inevitably at the hands of IT. So giving administrative credentials to users that they probably shouldn't have, and that user gets phished. It really is game on for the attacking organization. So key element here, education. Train your users, get your users in security awareness, and do that, at least some sort of cycle, at least annually, if not, semi-annual or even monthly. So.
All right, strong password policy. Again, this is one of the key requirements for cyber insurance carriers. Also, this is something that we focus on in the cyber risk analysis that I had mentioned. Password policy, password hygiene. A lot of times this is centralized around Active Directory. It tends to be kind of the source of truth for many organizations. So these the items in this list here, password history, age, length, all these things that you're very familiar with. Are they being effectively controlled? Are their policies actually in place? Are they being set? And then how does the password policy how does it align with your MFA approach? How does that change? How should it be modified if you have the MFA in place? So really, a lot of things to consider here. But certainly we can't stress enough the importance of and continued importance of password hygiene and password health.
All right, and number 4 on our list, backups. Obviously, the criticality behind backups, as Fran also mentioned, what they dealt with was credit card theft, but inevitably, part of this day and age, that would have been a major ransomware attack. And if you don't have the ability to recover from, ransomware encryption of your data, you're going to lose at the end of the day and pay a healthy ransom. And even at the end of the day, if you pay a healthy ransom, you hope that you get the encryption keys, because remember, at the end of the day, you're dealing with a criminal organization. So just look deep and think often about your backups and the severity of your backups, the criticality of your backups. One thing we're seeing a little bit of shift here is that we're getting into a space now where we're having operational backups for day-to-day, user recovery, user data loss, things along those lines. But also many organizations are looking at, long-term cyber backups that go along with the operational backups, and be happy to talk to you guys more about that if it's of interest. So.
Next generation firewalls. I think historically firewalls were a boundary security device that did packet filtering and stateful inspection. That was really their sole purpose. Many other security functions were layered into other types of security tooling, intrusion prevention, or maybe it's application proxy or things like that. Well, now those functions are integrated into next generation firewalls, or often UTM. It's called Unified Threat Management. So, we tie this to not only the requirement that we see from cyber insurance carriers, but again, our cyber risk analysis, where 1/3 of that engagement is focused on your firewalls and ensuring that not only do you have the correct type of firewalls, but are they configured appropriately? Because that's really what we often run into, is while the UTM features may have been purchased and it is an applicable and current modern firewall, it's just not performing the functions that it should be. So, very important not only to have next-gen firewalls, but also ensure that they're appropriately configured.
All right, and number 6 here on our list, endpoint protection. Obviously not going to step through this a whole lot, but the journey of endpoint protection has really changed, in the last few years here for sure. But we were doing a presentation the other day talking about, endpoint protection and those things. And sometimes still in organizations, we're seeing, organizations only running an antivirus tool. And the fact that antivirus tools were originally formed back in 1980, and here it is 2020, that technology most certainly has changed. As Fran mentioned, EDR, XDR, some of these things that vendors are offering are most certainly going to help you, defeat the cyber attack. So,
and the final critical point, patching your software. Again, this aligns with our cyber risk analysis, where we look for vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities typically are remedied, most often by patching. Patching may be from, or typically going to be from a vendor, a software vendor or hardware vendor, but these are the vulnerabilities that are exploited by bad actors. It's the things that they leverage to get into your environment, to hide, to dwell, cover their tracks, and then ultimately exfiltrate data. So staying patched, doing vulnerability scanning regularly, and ensuring that you don't have those critical vulnerabilities especially, is very important. We certainly recommend a strong vulnerability management program in your organization, and comprehensive testing and retesting and vulnerability scanning.
And retesting. So real quick here, I'm going to just a couple last slides that we have, talking a little bit more about insurance and the questionnaire. So when you start getting into this space, you're going to be sent from your cyber insurance company a questionnaire. It's going to ask you a few questions, usually check yes or no. But just know, if you are checking yes, ensure that you can prove that, because inevitably an auditors are going to show up and want to test that control for you. So with that, I'm going to close it out for questions, comments. But once again, I'd like to thank Fran and Josh both for your expertise and your time today. And I'll turn it over for questions. So.
There was one question in the chat about recommendation on password length. Do you prefer complex passwords with random letters, numbers, and symbols, or passwords that use short phrases with some symbols and numbers added on?
Yeah, well, I'll take that if that's all right. So certainly it depends. It's the standard IT answer of it depends. I think MFA certainly plays has an impact on your password policy. Recently, NIST has changed their recommendation, the guidelines, to moving from passwords to passphrases, being more than 14 characters if possible. And by doing that, you can certainly simplify those complexity rules and make a passphrase, where it can be very easy to remember, but difficult for a computer to guess. That's really what we're looking to achieve. So especially if you have MFA augmenting your password authentication, then I would absolutely look at lengthening those passwords and reducing the complexity requirements. Very simple sentences are a great, what I typically encourage users to think about. Something that I like to run before coffee every morning, something like that. It'd be very difficult for us to crack that, but very strong password.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
Yes, I see another question in the chat concerning the pen test. There's the question, what covers the pen test? So can you discuss a little bit more about what the pen test covers, maybe in comparison to the cyber risk analysis?
Yeah. So penetration testing is going to be very broad, but not as deep. So with penetration testing, generally what we're doing is looking for open source intelligence about an organization, looking for information about users, sensitive documents, passwords, information about the environment, internal infrastructure, IP address schemes, those type of things. And we do all of our reconnaissance. And then after we collect all of that information, then we start to look at exploiting. So can we exploit boundary security? Can we do social engineering, phishing, smishing, vishing, any other way to get around those boundary securities? And then once inside the environment, then what can we do? And that's where typically we're going to be looking for those vulnerabilities. So how can we get into a system? How can we access data? And how could we demonstrate that we could have exfiltrated that data? We won't actually, send your data out. We don't do anything malicious, but we will demonstrate how we could have done that. So it's very broad. The results are much less focused than a cyber risk analysis, where in the CRA will tell you step by step, here's what you need to do to correct this issue that we identified and why. And a pen test is just going to be, here's what we encountered in this specific use case. Here's what we did. Here's what you need to do to fix this acute thing, as opposed to a more broad coverage like the CRA.
Thanks, Josh. I don't see any more questions.
All right. Well, with that, we really thank everybody for your time this afternoon. As I mentioned, Fran, Josh, thank you again for your expertise and the things that you carry in the cyberspace. So it's critical for organizations to learn, these things can and how they happen. So again, thank you for the time. Please reach out if you have any further questions. We'd be happy to share more time and opportunity with you if it makes sense. So.
All right. Thank you all.
All right. Take care.